Hey guys, in today's video, I want to show you how to connect to a SQL database in Go. So we're going to be creating a simple CRUD API with Gin as well. So we're going to be using the Gin web framework, and we're going to be connecting to a MySQL database. This works with any SQL database. You just have to change the SQL drivers. So let's get started, and let's first just go to our IDE. And I'm assuming you already have a database ready. So I just here have a database running on my local host with a test DB, and inside of that I just have a posts table. I'll leave the schema to this post table in the description so you can just create that post table. Okay, so let's start off by first initializing our Go modules. Let's do a Go mod init. I'm going to call this Go tutorial, and let's grab the SQL driver. So I'm using MySQL, so therefore I'm going to go for the Go MySQL driver, and let's just grab this and install it. So now that we have that, let's also grab the Gin web framework. And of course, if you guys are using something like Postgres, you want to look for the Go SQL driver for Postgres, and everything else will be very similar. Okay, now that we have those two, let's create a main.go file with our main package and our function main. So what I actually want to do is create a database connection that can be used throughout the entire project. So I'm going to create a new folder, calling it db client. Now within db client, I'm just going to create a Go file, db client.go. So this is going to be our db client package. And in here, I'm going to create a function that is actually going to connect us to our SQL database. So your SQL database should already be running at this stage. So I'm just going to name this function initialize db connection. Now to create a database connection, we have to use the SQL package, and we're going to be using the sql.open function. Now this expects two parameters. The first is the driver name, and the second is the data source name. So I'll explain what those are. So the driver name is quite simple. It's actually just what your driver is. So we're going to be using MySQL, and we actually do need to use this. So the SQL driver that we just imported, we actually need to use this as an unused import. So let's just grab that as well. So we have the MySQL driver here, and here you can see it says unused import. So instead, we just want to put a underscore here because we're going to use its side effects. So now we can actually use MySQL here. And of course, if this was like Postgres, you want to put Postgres here. Then you have the data source name. You want to look at your driver, and it will, if you go to the documentation for this, so this is just the GitHub page, I'll put a link to this in the description. You'll find there to be here, so DSN, data source name, and this is the structure that it has to be in. So let's just copy this and comment it out just so we have a reference. So we first have our username of our database, so of the user who's connecting to the database, the password for that user, and then the protocol we're going to be using, the address, and the database. So let's actually do this. So my username is root. I don't actually have a password, so I'm just going to leave that empty. And then we put the @ symbol. Then we want to specify the protocol. So we're going to be using a TCP protocol. And then in brackets, the address. So I'm just going to be using localhost and then on port 3306. And then we specify the database name. So I called it testdb. This is just here, test_db. And then we can add in any other parameters. So one parameter that I always like to add is the pass time, and then just set that equal to true. So what this will do is it will actually scan times, like timestamps, into the time.time type. So this type that Go actually provides us, that's a struct, this will actually be able to scan times, like things like timestamps, into this. And later on, I'm also going to show you guys how to do this with SQLx. You guys will understand why as we go through this. You understand why it might be a little bit easier later on to actually use something like SQLx. But anyway, for now, so this returns us two things: the database connection and an error in case something goes wrong, like it can't connect. So here we have the actual database and then an error. So if the error is not equal to nil, then I actually just want to panic with that error. Otherwise, I want to just do a database.ping, so just to make sure that's actually connected. Once again, this also throws an error. So let's do the same thing. And if that throws an error, we also want to panic out. This is just to check that we actually are connected to our database. And finally, if everything's good here, then I actually want to expose this database connection. So once again, this is just a SQL.db. So it's of this type and it's a pointer. So I just want to expose this to the entire project. So to do that, I'm just going to create a variable out here, calling it database client, which is going to be a pointer to SQL.db. And then we're just going to say db client is equal to db. So we're just saying this global variable, and this is global because because it's capitalized here, so it's actually being exported from our db client package. I'm just going to set that to the database connection, which as long as these two errors don't, as long as there are no errors here, this should go successfully. So then inside main, I'm just going to do db client dot initialize database connection. Okay, so let's just run run main.go. So this should actually just cancel out straight away. That's because we're not waiting for anything. But as you can see, there wasn't any panics here, so we can assume that these were fine. Next, let's just set up a basic gin server. So let's say r, which is going to be a router, is equal to gin.default. And let's say gin.run. And let's run this on port 5000. And this does return an error. So we can say if error is equal to this, and the error is not equal to nil, I'm just going to do panic that error. So if the gin server for some reason can't start up, then we just want to panic. Okay, so now I'm going to create another folder, calling it controllers. And in here, let's say post controller. So I'm just going to create some functions. So create a post. Let's actually just start off with this one for now. So let's do create post. And if you guys aren't familiar with Gin, I do have a video about it. So that's why I'm not going into in depth as to what I'm doing when on the Gin side of things. But I do have a video to that. So there'll be a link in the description to that. Okay, so this create post is just going to be a route. That's going to be a post route. And let's just connect it to the controllers dot create post handler. And I'm going to create a type here. So post is going to look like this. It's going to have an ID of int. It's going to have let's just check our database. That's title, content, and created at. So title, string, content is also going to be a string, and created at is going to be a time. Then if I just add the JSONs for these. Okay, so we have our post struct. So this is our one row in our database has this following structure. So to create a post, I'm just going to first bind the JSON from the request body into a post. So let's say request body is of type post, and then I'm just going to bind it to the request body. This does throw an error, so let's catch that. If error is to this and the error is not equal to nil, we want to return, and we want to do c.json. Let's just say http.status unprocessable entity. And then there's also throw in a nice little message. Error true. Invalid response request body. Okay, so I'm not going to deal with the validation because that could be a video in itself and something that I'm considering doing. So if you guys want to learn about how to validate request bodies, then just let me know in the comments below and I'll make a video on that. But here we're not actually going to deal with that because that would take a little while. So instead, we're just going to always make sure that when we're making the requests that we have all the data. Okay, so we want to create a post and we have the data here. So what we want to do is use this database client and then execute a query where we insert into the database. So if we get the db client from our db client package, on this, we have a couple of methods that we can run. What I want to run is the exec, so execute. And then the first parameter this expects is the query that we're going to execute. So what I want to do is insert into my posts table. I want to insert the following. So the first is the title and the content. So title, content, and then the values are just going to be question marks. So the reason we put question marks here is so that these values are actually escaped. So this way it protects us against SQL injections. So even if, let's say the title, let's say title was equal to something like drop posts table or something, then it wouldn't run. Instead it would save that title as the literal string drop whatever table. So this is just to protect us against SQL injections. So this is the first parameter that this expects, the query. The next is actually the args, so the arguments that we're going to pass. And this is a variadic parameter, so we can pass in as many as we want. And it has to be equal to the number of question marks that we have here. And a quick note, this is for MySQL. I think in Postgres there's a different symbol, and in other SQL databases there are slightly different symbols. So you want to check your driver as to what symbol it is that you need to be using. So the first argument that we want to pass to it is the title. So I'm just going to say request data body dot title, and if we just multi-line this, and the second one is the request body dot content. So here what will happen is this title here will be put into here and it will be escaped, and the content here will be put into this question mark and it will also be escaped. So this can throw an error, and it also gives us a result. So the error, if it throws an error, so if error is not equal to nil, then I actually just want to return an error here and just say status internal server error, and I just leave it like that. Otherwise we get res. So res has a couple of things that we can access on it. So we have the last inserted ID. So here in my database, the ID is a auto incrementing integer. So if we want to, for example, return what ID was created for this post, then we have to use this last inserted ID. And this returns the ID as a int 64 and also returns an error. Now I'm actually going to ignore the error. And I think just for the sake of saving space, I'm also going to ignore the error here. If you're wondering what could throw an error, if this is has a syntax error, then that could throw an error. If let's say we had another argument here that we're expecting, that could also throw an error. So normally you 100% should be looking for these errors, but just for the sake of this video, I'm not going to be capturing those errors. But as you saw before, that is roughly how we would handle it. We would just do an if statement for that error and then catch it like that. So here we can get the last inserted ID, and we can also do rows affected. So if we are executing a query such as deleting something, we want to actually check how many things we deleted, then we would do rows affected. That's what we would use this for. Here, what I'm going to do is just a c.json HTTP status created, and then just do gen.h, say error is false, and the ID is this ID. Okay, so now that we have this, let's actually test this out. So let's open up our terminal, go run main.go. So now we're connected, and I'm going to open up Postman, go to localhost 5000, and if you remember, we just said this is a post request to just the base path. So if we do a post request and we set the JSON data, where we just want title, some title, and content to be some content. So now if we save this, we see error is false, and we get an ID of 1. So if I could check my database now and I refresh, you can see we have this row here. that is how we create a new entry. So if I keep calling this, you can see that the ID is incrementing. If I refresh this, we have the new rows. Okay, so that's nice. Now let's actually be able to get all of our posts. So now I'm going to create a new function and get posts, get the gen context. And then what I want to do is create a variable to hold our posts that we're going to fetch from the database. So I'm just going to say posts is a slice of post. Then I'm going to get the database client again. And then this time I'm going to query. And you might notice there are a couple of queries. So there's query and there's query row. And there's also query context and query row context. So query is used for fetching multiple rows. So this is just anything more than one. And query row is if you want to just fetch one row. Context is if you want to use something like a database transaction. So query context is the same as query, except it expects a context, so a SQL transaction. And query row context is the same as query row, except obviously it also expects a SQL transaction context. So we're going to be doing query here because we're expecting this is going to get all of the posts. So this has a similar function signature to exec, where it expects the query and then the args, so the arguments. So the query is going to be select ID, title, content, and created at from posts. And we're not going to put anywhere, so this is just going to get all of them. And then we have no arguments here, so we can actually just leave out the arguments. And this is going to return to us two things, rows and error. So if error is not equal to nil, then I just want to return that. So let's just grab this error here. And I'm just going to leave the message out. Of course, you should probably have a standard way of handling your error messages. The purpose of this video isn't to show you how to structure error messages or anything like that. It's just to show you how to interact with a SQL database in Go. So now we're handling the error. What are these rows? So rows, what we can do is we can loop through it. So what we would do is we'd create a for loop and we'd say rows.next. So rows.next returns a boolean and it will keep being true until we're done with scanning all the rows, and then it will be false and it will break out of this for loop. So here we're scanning through all the rows, so that's for each row we have, it's gonna loop through it. And then I'm gonna create a variable here called single post, which is just gonna be of type post. And the reason we're creating this is because we're gonna populate this with one of the rows and then append it to our existing post slice. So I'm gonna say rows.scan. So scan is what you use when you want to map or just scan through all of the data you got. So in our case, the ID, title, content, and created at, we want to scan those into this struct here. So the way that we do that is we pass pointers to where we want to scan it to. And the order of this is actually important. So the first one, so in our select, you can see the first value we get is the ID. So here we have to say the first is the post, single post.id. And this can throw an error if, for example, let's say ID was a string. In our case here, ID is actually an int, so it will throw an error. And you'll see that here, this actually does throw an error. So let's catch that. And if that's true, let's just copy and paste that. But here, this won't work. So let's say we were to do all of these, so single post dot title, because title's next, and then the content, and then the created at. So this actually won't work. What we have to do is we have to pass pointers to these. So for each one, we want to pass in a pointer. So now it's the rows.scan is going to go to the pointer of this, so wherever that is, and it's going to put the current row that we're on into post single post.id. And once again, this can throw an error if this is something like a if the types don't match. So if you try to scan a string into an int, then that's going to throw an error. Similarly, if you try to scan null into an int, that will also throw an error. Just a quick note, the way you would get around null is through pointers. So as an example, if content was a nullable field, I would put a pointer here because pointers can be null, so which is equivalent to null. So once again, if this was possibly null, then I'd put a pointer here. But in our case, in the database, the content column is actually not null. That's fine. So now we have this post here, and if this all goes through row, then post should be populated with all of the data from that current row. So what I'm going to do is just say posts, which is the variable we initialized up here, and I'm going to append to this a single post. Then once all of this is done, we're just going to return c.json, HTTP status OK, which is equivalent to 200, and just the posts. Okay, so now let's test that out. Let's create a GET request, and this is going to be GET posts. So now if we restart the server, and we open up Postman again, this time this changes to a GET request, and send that, you can see we have all of the posts here, all the way up until 5. And I know these all have the same text, so I'm just going to change it up a bit, and then just fetch the data again, just so you can see that these are actually unique. So you can see some title 2, some 2, 11, 11 again. So we are actually getting the data from the database. Okay, so I showed you guys how to get all the posts, but now what if you wanted to only get an individual post? So let's handle that. So func get post, get the gen context, and then this is going to be a parameter. Let's say id string is equal to this, and we actually want this as an array, as an integer, sorry. So we're going to use string convert, and then this expects the string, and it returns to us the ID as an integer or an error. I'm just going to ignore the error for now. Okay, and in case you guys are wondering what this would look like, it would just be like this. So this is why I'm saying we have a parameter, because we are going to be getting this parameter from the URL. This is going to be the ID of the element that we're trying to, of the row that we're trying to access. And I am just ignoring the errors for now. So now instead of using query, we're going to use query row. So let's say db client.db client query row. So I'm going to select ID, title, content, and created at from posts, where the ID is equal to something. So here, the ID is a parameter, which I'm just going to pass as this parameter. So it's going to take that ID, escape it into here to protect us from SQL injections. And this returns to us a row. And then what we can do is do row.scan. So now it's actually very similar to this section here, where row.scan can return an error. So we're going to say row.scan. And if the error is not equal to null, then I'm just going to return an error. Now let's actually create a variable. So post is of type post. And the same as before, we have to make sure to get this in the correct order. So we have to do the ID first, title, content, and then created at. The post.id, post.title, post.content, and then post.created at. Then if everything's fine, we just return we just want to return the post. Okay, so now let's test this out. I think first let's actually just create a couple. So create that one and that one. So we created one with ID of 6 and one with ID of 7. So now if I do a GET request for 6, we get this one. And now if I do a GET request with 7 in the URL, we get the second one. So that is working nicely. And if we do something like an ID that doesn't exist, then we get error. So this will return a error here, and the type of this error is actually this. So it's SQL.error no rows. And if I put this in the response, so if I do message is error.error, and I restart the server. Okay, so if we restart this and we check Postman now, the error is just this SQL no rows in results set, which is identical to this error here. SQL no rows in results set. So if you ever want to check if there's no rows, you would just do something like, if the error is equal to SQL error no rows, then maybe return some nicer message like status not found. And then if we format it like this, and we start the server again, then this time, oh, I forgot to return. But as you can see here, the status is actually 404. And if we were to do something that exists, like 7, we get 200. Because I've shown you guys how to create and get using query, and get using query row. Now one thing I actually want to show you guys is a package called SQLx. So you'll understand now, once we go through SQLx, why I think this is a lot easier to use and why I actually recommend it. So if we just get this package, so if we paste that in, so if we actually just look at the documentation, what SQLx allows us to do is actually scan to a struct. And it makes things a lot easier compared to using query and query row. So to use it, the first thing we have to do is actually just come here to our connection and instead use SQLx dot new deep. I think we can just do open. Yeah. So it's actually going to be the exact same as this. So I'm going to copy it, paste it in here, and this is very similar where it returns DB and error. Except the DB that it returns here isn't of type, isn't the SQL DB, it's the SQLx DB. Now, if we look at our posts, you can see that it actually won't throw an error. So if I was to start up the server again, and let's say test something out like this, it's still working. So SQLx just wraps the SQL package. So a lot of the same methods are still available, like query row is still available. You can still use that, which makes it really easy to swap to if you already have a project that already uses the SQL driver. So why do I suggest using SQLx? Well, let's take this example here. So we are scanning into this posts. You can see we're having to do quite a bit of manual work. Now, if we were to do this with SQLx, then it would be dbclient.dbclient. And we have these two methods. So we have get and we have select. So get is to get a single row and select is to get a slice of rows. So similar to this would be query row and this would be query. So if we look at the signature of this, it expects a destination, which is going to be a pointer, the query string, and the arguments. And then this returns an error. So let's actually copy this. Let's paste it in here. This is a string. Oh, and actually first it expects the destination. So destination for this is posts. And then we have the query string, and we don't actually have any arguments. So just to clean things up a little bit, I'm just going to remove all of these. So here we have posts. And we are actually, oh, this is the get all posts. So we actually want to move this to the select one. Once again, get only gets one row, but here we're trying to get all the rows. So we're going to use select. And now what this will do is it will automatically scan the fields here according to their name into this struct here. Now let's say you had a different name to what the struct is. So here we call this ID, and in the database it's ID. Then what we will do is as an additional tag, we would just say db and then specify the name here. So in our case, it's still ID. And if I actually do this for all of them, it's just something that I often like to do. In case the name here changes, this would need to still reflect whatever the column is called in the database. And this would be created at. So now we've specified what the database names are. And of course, this isn't required unless your name here is different to what the name of the column is in the database. Now, if we come down here, this returns an error, which actually is just for now, ignore the error. But yeah, that's it. This is all we have to do to scan into a error slice. So it's a lot less code than what we had before. And let's actually do the same for this. So instead of having to do all this, let's keep this variable here. Instead of having to actually scan it ourselves, let's delete that. Let's copy the string. And then we're going to say db client, not db client. And this time we're trying to get a single row. So we're going to use get. We're going to say we want to map this. We want to scan this to this post variable we have here, which is of type post. Just provide the string. And then the ID is the same as before, where the arguments are just a variadic parameter at the end. So the only thing different between these two is here we get rows back, but here, and we get rows back and it only expects the query and the ID. But with get, it expects the destination where it wants to map this to, where it wants to scan this to, and still expects the query and the ID or whatever other arguments that you have. So now, if I remove that, this just returns an error as well, which I'm just going to ignore for now. So you can see these are a lot smaller than us using the standard SQL package. So let's test this and actually make sure it's working. So we have an unused import. Let's remove that. So now we've started it up. Let's get 7 again, and you can see it's still working, it's still the same. So now one thing I want to point out is this. So let's say I remove, so created at, if I'm going to remove the database name here, will actually throw an error. So I think if I scan this, you can see it's actually not working. And if I log the error for that, so if the error is not equal to null, you just want to print this to stand it out. And you can see missing destination name created at in the post type. So now if I add this back in, created at, you'll see that now it should work. And if I run this, you can see we're not getting any error here and it's working. But at the same time, if I was to remove it for the database, for the ID one here, and we were to restart the server, and if I was to run this again, you can see we're not getting an error this time. The reason for this is ID is the same as the column in the database, they're both ID, but created at is not the same because in the database, that column expects a underscore. So this is what it looks like in the database, it has a underscore. And here we don't have an underscore. So that's the reason why. Only for this one, we can actually remove it for all of them, apart from created at. Only for created at, where it's slightly different to the column name in the database, do we have to use this. And another point is this uses the values here. So the name of the values here. So if you're doing something like posts, so if you had multiple tables being left joined or joined on, and then you're accessing it like this, you might want to do as ID because it's going to use this name here or this name here to actually scan it into the struct. So just keep that in mind. But yeah, that's it for this video. I know it was quite a simple one and we didn't go over too much. I know I didn't go over so we did the create, get, and the get. So get single and get multiple. The reason I didn't go over update and delete is because they're very similar to the create one, where you just do the update query, and the delete would just be the delete query. The main thing I want to show you guys is this execute method. And the main thing you want to learn on this is that it could throw an error. So just keep that in mind. Remember to handle the errors. I'm just not doing it in this video. And the two key methods that we get back from this result is the last inserted ID and the affected rows. So that's all there is for the execute. And then when it comes to actually scanning data into variables, I recommend using SQLx. It's very simple and it's very, very similar to the existing SQL package. But it gives us these two very nice methods, get and select, where select will get you a slice or get you multiple rows from whatever you selected here. And it will just automatically scan it into the struct here. And if the name here, the name of the struct, whatever field it is, differs from the name of the column in your database, then you want to specify here as an additional key, db, and then the name of the column in your database. You don't need to do this for fields that already have the same name as the column name in the database. So just keep that in mind. And you want to also make sure that these are pointers. So this will, whenever you're scanning into something, you have to provide a pointer to it instead of a copy of it. And this also does return an error. So you would want to take care of that error. And this returns the same errors as the SQL package. So this error could be, for example, SQL.error no rows. So if there's no rows, then even the SQLs package will still throw the same errors. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I hope it made sense. If you guys are interested in me making more Go videos, think about making one to show you guys how to use a JSON web token, and maybe one to show you guys how to handle validation, since I think that's a fairly important thing, that you have nice validation messages. So if you guys enjoyed this video, I'd appreciate a like. If you want to see more Go videos, then just let me know in the comments below what you want to see. And I'd also appreciate a subscribe. It really helps me out. So yeah, thanks for watching. Bye.